The weapon wasn't the problem. It was the way the human handed it over. Fleet Admiral Yara Chen stood at the dead center of the Conclave's ceremonial disarmament chamber, framed by the towering obsidian arches of galactic authority. Surrounding her were high delegates from 17 alien species, beings whose empires had collectively written the laws of this galaxy for over 4,000 years. They had gathered to witness what they believed to be the ultimate triumph of diplomacy, the absolute, unconditional neutralization of humanity's military machine. And yet, Fleet Admiral Chen was smiling. It wasn't the tight, strained diplomatic smile of a defeated commander surrendering her life's work. It was something else entirely, a subtle, cold curl at the corner of her lips that Savath 9, the chief analyst for the Co-Institute of Threat Assessment, could not classify. Savath 9's atmospheric sensors registered a slight elevation in Chen's cardiovascular rate. Her pupils had dilated just a fraction. But her hands, as she unclipped her ceremonial sidearm and laid it gently onto the glowing disarmament plinth, were perfectly, terrifyingly still. Savath 9 recorded every micro-expression. He had been studying human behavior for 6 years, sifting through millions of data points, trying to parse the chaotic psychology of the galaxy's youngest spacefaring race. Stand there in the observation gallery, watching Chen smile as humanity formally surrendered its grand fleet, he felt a sudden, icy knot form in his chest. For the first time in his long, distinguished career, Savath 9 was afraid. Not of the weapon on the plinth, but of what lay hidden behind the human's eyes. 14 months earlier, the Galactic Conclave had passed Resolution 7 Theta. The vote had been unanimous. 17 species, including humanity's few tentative trade allies, had raised their hands in approval. To any species that processed logic through standard analytical models, the rationale behind the resolution was unassailable. Humanity had arrived on the galactic stage a mere 40 years prior. In that brief eye blink of cosmic time, the Terran Union had fought 3 major interstellar wars. They had ended 2 of them using tactics that still haunted the nightmares of senior Conclave military strategists. Worse, human weapon technology was advancing at a velocity that the Co-Institute had classified as biologically and industrially implausible. They were small, they were loud. And they possessed an unpredictable, aggressive instinct that defied every predictive algorithm the Conclave owned. Their primary force, the Terran Combined Arms Fleet, comprised 2,412 warships. It was the most heavily armed, densely armored collection of void craft ever assembled by a species in its first half-century of space travel. To the ancient empires, humanity looked like a child playing with a primed plasma charge in a room full of gunpowder. Resolution 7 Theta was designed to strip that charge away. Under its strict terms, humanity was ordered to surrender every single warship to Conclave custody. They were allowed to retain a paltry 40 unarmed diplomatic transports and submit to a mandatory 20-year structural overhaul under galactic supervision. In exchange, Earth would receive unrestricted trade access, massive infrastructure investments, and a permanent observer seat on 3 secondary councils. They accepted without a single objection. Secretary-General Orth Mose, a tall, pale-furred Veldroni, had announced to the chamber after the vote. When the news broke, a massive wave of relief had washed over the galactic capital. Cheering was considered primitive in high Conclave culture, but the drop in ambient tension was almost physical. Only Savath 9 had raised a red flag. In his official analysis submitted 3 days after the vote, he wrote a brief, urgent note: the human delegation accepted a 400-page legal framework within 6 hours of receipt, without submitting a single counter-negotiation clause. This behavior is statistically anomalous. Requesting immediate strategic review. Nobody reviewed it. Why did they agree so fast? Savath 9 asked his junior assistant, a young Keth analyst named Preth. As they stood in the observation gallery watching the first wave of Terran destroyers dock into the Conclave's holding bays. The terms are incredibly generous, sir, Preth replied, consulting his data pack. The infrastructure grants alone will boost their industrial capacity by 30%. No, Savath 9 interrupted, pointing down toward the docking bay. Below them, a human maintenance crew was disembarking from a heavy cruiser. They weren't hanging their heads. They weren't acting like conquered soldiers. One of them said something, and the others burst into laughter, slapping each other's shoulders before heading toward the transit quarters. "Run the negotiation timeline again, Plinth." Not the words, the timing. Plinth tapped his console, pausing as the raw data refreshed. Their decision delay was non-existent. Standard diplomatic processing for a document of that length requires at least 3 weeks of legal review. Sabbath 9 turned away from the glass. Either the humans signed a document they never bothered to read, or they were reading a script we hadn't sent them yet. "I don't understand the difference," Plinth admitted. "Neither do I," Sabbath 9 whispered, watching Admiral Chen walk calmly out of the disarmament chamber. "And that is precisely what terrifies me. The transfer of the Terran Combined Arms Fleet took 8 months to complete. On paper, it was a masterclass in bureaucratic efficiency. Every single one of the 2,412 Terran warships was delivered precisely on schedule. Crew manifests were verified to the last decimal point, weapon systems were powered down and confirmed inert. And human officers handed over the primary access codes without a single murmur of protest. Conclave technical teams went over each ship with extreme thoroughness. They used diagnostic scanners sensitive enough to detect an unshielded plasma sidearm from 40 meters away. They swept the command bridges, probed the reactor cores, and dismantled the secondary weapons bays of over 200 destroyers. They found nothing out of order. By every measurable standard established under Resolution 7 Theta, the human fleet was clean. Except for one detail. It was a minor detail, buried deep within the routine intake logs, a detail that the primary conclave inspection teams noted, filed away, and collectively decided was not worth escalating up the chain of command. The fuel reserves. Every single transferred Terran vessel had been delivered into conclave custody with full fuel cells. Not the 30% operational level standard for ships being pulled out of active duty. Not the bare minimum transit reserves typically left in vessels headed for long-term orbital storage. Every warship carried 100% charge of refined antimatter fuel, freshly topped off as if they had been prepped for a long-range battle deployment just hours before the transfer. The Conclave's chief logistics officer, a Dreth bureaucrat named Kas-Sik Sorum, had dismissed it in his official assessment with a single line. Human operational standards likely require full reserve maintenance for regulatory compliance. No security implication identified. Sabbath 9 found the entry 6 weeks later while cross-referencing routine supply manifests. He stared at the line on his glass display for nearly 20 minutes without blinking. "Full reserves," Sabbath 9 muttered to himself in his dimly lit office. "Why fuel a ship you know you are surrendering? Why spend millions of credits refining antimatter just to hand it over to your custodian?" He opened a new analytical report and began typing rapidly. He got 3 paragraphs into his thesis before his terminal chimed. It was his direct supervisor at the Ku Institute. "Sabbath 9, the supervisor's voice buzzed over the audio channel, cold and dismissive. "I see an unassigned draft in your queue regarding the Terran disarmament file. Resolution 7 Theta is closed. The fleet is in our bays. Stop wasting Institute processing power on resolved cases. Director, the fuel signatures, the Dreth Logistics Division has already signed off," the supervisor interrupted. "The humans will simply follow their rigid military protocols. Close the file, Sabbath." The channel clicked dead. Sabbath 9 stopped typing. But he did not stop thinking. 2 months later, the Conclave hosted its annual winter session, the largest diplomatic gathering in 40 years. The mood across the capital station was triumphant. Secretary-General Orthmos delivered an opening address that lasted over 2 hours. Proudly repeating the phrase, "the dawn of enduring peace," 7 separate times to wild applause from the assembled delegations. In the human observation gallery, Delegate First Class Mira Vasquez sat alone. She was a compact, sharp-featured woman wearing the dark blue diplomatic uniform of the Terran Union, accented by a single silver stripe across the collar. She had brought no aides, no legal advisors, and no security detail. In a gallery designed to seat 40 representatives, she sat in the center of the front row, completely isolated. Savath 9 monitored her through the gallery's security feed throughout the entire 2-hour speech. Vasquez never moved. She never looked bored. She never looked relieved. For reasons Savath 9 could not articulate in any language he spoke, her posture reminded him of someone sitting quietly in a theater, watching an enemy give a grand toast at their own funeral. And finding the entire performance deeply, privately hilarious. Savath 9 clipped the security footage, flagged it for psychological review, and forwarded it to 3 senior analysts in his department. 2 of them ignored the file entirely. The third sent back a brief reply, "You've been studying the humans for too long, Savath. You're finding ghosts in empty rooms." Maybe, Savath 9 thought, closing his eyes as he watched Vasquez calmly sip her water on the screen. Maybe I am. Or maybe everyone else is standing in a burning room and complimenting the warmth. The first undeniable sign that something was deeply wrong came 4 months after the disarmament was declared complete. And it came from a corner of the galaxy no one in the High Council was paying attention to, the Terran Civilian Shipping Registry. A routine automated sweep by a Conclave trade monitoring station in the Kepler transit corridor flagged a minor statistical anomaly. Over the 14 months following the passage of Resolution 7 Theta, the total number of registered Terran civilian freighters had spiked by roughly 12%. On the surface, this was not alarming. With military budgets slashed, human commercial enterprise was expected to expand. But when Savath 9 dug into the underlying registry data, he discovered something extraordinary. The newly registered civilian freighters were overwhelmingly built in one very specific hull class, a tonnage, length, and engine profile that matched, down to the exact meter. The hull specifications of a Terran heavy destroyer. Savath 9 immediately called an emergency meeting with Cas-6 Sorum. "It's a coincidence," Cas-6 said, tossing the data sheet back across his desk. "They're reusing industrial hull molds to save on manufacturing costs." "It is 412 vessels, Cas-6, Savath 9 said, leaning over the desk. 412 heavy freighters in 14 months. Human civilian shipyards do not possess the industrial capacity to build 412 ships of that scale in that time frame. Their construction speed would have to be 6 times higher than their historical peak." Cas-6 frowned, looking down at the numbers again. "Then where did they come from?" Savath 9 placed a second data sheet on the desk. "These ships were not built, Cas-6. They were reclassified." Cas-6 Sorum stared at the second data sheet for a long time. The ambient hum of the logistics station filled the silence, heavy and oppressive. "Get me the physical scan records from the transfer inspections," Cas-6 said, his voice dropping an octave. "The ones our teams performed when the fleet was handed over." "I already pulled them," Savath 9 replied calmly, pulling up a holographic display between them. Every single one of those 412 vessels was inspected by Conclave personnel. The weapons systems were completely absent. No kinetic rail cannons, no torpedo racks, no offensive missile pods. Their hull mountings were capped with standard civilian cargo plates. Under Conclave law, they are perfectly clean. "Then what are you actually suggesting, Savath?" Cas-6 demanded, rubbing his brow. "That the humans manufactured thousands of phantom warships just to surrender them? I am suggesting that 412 clean, fully fueled destroyer-class hulls are currently operating along our key trade corridors under civilian registration," Savath 9 said, scrolling to the next section of his report. "And when I cross-referenced the crew manifests of these freighters with old Terran naval personnel databases, I discovered something even more disturbing. 92% of the crew members aboard these civilian vessels are recently discharged Terran naval officers, engineers, and gunnery specialists. Savath 9 leaned forward, his dark compound eyes reflecting the blue glow of the console. I think, Cas 6, that we have completely misunderstood what the word disarmed means to a human. The implication sent a chill through the bureaucrat. 3 days after Savath 9 formally submitted his findings, the Conclave convened a secret emergency investigation. The report had been suppressed for 11 agonizing days by nervous lower-level officials before someone with enough clearance, and enough terror, forwarded it directly to the High Council. The investigation was classified at the absolute highest level of galactic security. Representatives from 7 major species sat on the panel. No human delegates were informed, and no notification was sent to the Terran diplomatic mission on Earth. The question before the committee was simple: had humanity violated Resolution 7 Theta by covertly maintaining an active military fleet under the guise of commercial shipping? It took the legal team 2 days to return an answer, and it was far from simple. They have not violated the resolution, declared Tirth Kelm, a senior Veldroni jurist, her voice echoing in the restricted chamber. Resolution 7 Theta explicitly mandated the surrender of all active vessels registered under the Terran Combined Arms Fleet. However, the human legal team reclassified these 412 ships before the resolution was officially signed into law. Legally speaking, these vessels were never part of the military fleet that was surrendered. They were already private corporate assets. They swapped the registration papers on warship hulls, slammed the Dreth delegate, banging his heavy fist on the table. They stripped the guns off destroyers, called them cargo haulers, and kept the same damn crews on board. Where are the weapons, jurist? Where did they put the railguns they removed? Tirth Kelm hesitated, her posture stiffening. Our deep space tracking teams do not know. Sitting in the gallery corner, reviewing the live transcripts he had bypassed security to access, Savath 9 stopped reading. He reread that single line 3 times. We do not know. He closed the legal file and pulled up a private database he had been secretly building for over 7 months, a timeline tracking human logistics during the months leading up to the disarmament vote. 18 months prior to the vote, long before Resolution 7 Theta was ever introduced to the conclave floor, Terran military transport logs registered a massive, unexplained surge in deep space traffic in the outer Sol system. Thousands of heavy freighters had made quiet, unannounced runs toward 3 massive asteroid mining complexes in the Kuiper Belt. Facilities that were officially catalogued in conclave records as decommissioned metal salvage yards. Savath 9's breath hitched as the realization crystallized in his mind. The humans hadn't hidden their weapons after the disarmament resolution was passed. They had hidden them before the conclave even drafted it. Humanity had known. Somehow, through intelligence networks or sheer predictive grand strategy, Earth's High Command had anticipated the disarmament mandate years in advance. In the window between knowing and surrendering, they had systematically, legally, and meticulously separated their heavy weaponry from their ship hulls. They had stored the guns in the dark depths of the asteroid belt, reclassified the hulls as civilian freighters, and presented the conclave with a grand illusion of total, humble compliance. Savath 9 sat back in his chair, feeling a profound sense of vertigo. He remembered Fleet Admiral Chen's quiet, unsettling smile in the disarmament chamber. He remembered the full fuel tanks on every surrendered ship sitting in the conclave's holding bays. He remembered Ambassador Vasquez sitting alone in the gallery, watching the Secretary-General boast about enduring peace. Everything the conclave believed it had accomplished over the past 2 years was nothing more than a carefully crafted narrative written by the humans themselves. Savath 9 immediately requested a private audience with Secretary-General Orthmos. It was granted within 4 hours, a clear sign that the leader of the conclave was already deeply rattled. They didn't disarm, Secretary-General, Savath 9 said the moment the heavy blast doors sealed shut behind him. They reorganized. Secretary General Orthmos did not look up immediately when Savath 9 entered the room. He stood at his floor-to-ceiling panoramic window, gazing out over the sprawling ring of the Conclave orbital station. Below them, bathed in the pale blue light of the central star, lay the massive docking bays holding thousands of silent, surrendered Terran warships. Reorganized, Orthmos repeated quietly, the pale fur along his neck twitching involuntarily. That is a very dangerous word to bring into this office, analyst. It is the only accurate word we have, sir, Savath 9 replied, placing 2 encrypted datapads onto the Secretary General's desk. Everything we accepted from the Terran Union was technically compliant with Resolution 7 Theta, but operationally, it was completely meaningless. The surrendered ships sitting in our bays have no weapons, yes. But the ships know exactly where their weapons are. Orthmos turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. Explain. Savath 9 activated the first datapad, projecting a 3D tactical map of the Sol system. Over the past 7 months, I have been reverse engineering Earth's deep space logistical chain. I analyzed thermal signatures, sublight transit corridors, and high-density supply runs leading into the outer Sol belt. Those 3 asteroid facilities, officially logged in our registries as abandoned salvage yards, are not scrap yards. They are high-security military armories. He zoomed in on a dense cluster of metallic asteroids. Red telemetry lines connected the belt to trade lanes spanning 3 sectors. Working backward from the energy signatures recorded during their salvage operations, those 3 belt complexes hold enough pre-staged weapons payloads, heavy railgun assemblies, plasma batteries, and tactical torpedo tubes, to fully refit approximately 2,000 vessels. Orthmos leaned over the desk, his long fingers pressing into the polished surface. 2,000. The reclassified civilian fleet you reported consists of 412 destroyers. Where do the other weapons go? That is what kept me awake for 3 weeks, Savath 9 said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. We can account for where the weapons went for 2,000 ships. But I could not reconcile the math until I looked at the surrendered fleet down in our docks. Silence descended upon the Grand Office, heavy and suffocating. The transferred vessels, Orthmos said, his voice barely audible. The ones delivered to us were delivered with full fuel reserves, Savath 9 finished. Clean weapon scans. Perfect legal compliance. And I have been unable to sleep because I could not determine why a commander would top off the antimatter tanks of 2,000 warships heading straight into a custodian storage dock. Savath 9 looked directly into the Secretary General's eyes. They were not fueled so they could sit in our bays, sir. They were fueled so that when the time came, they could fly out of our bays. Orthmos stiffened. He walked back to the window, staring down at the endless rows of Terran hulls cradled in the station's magnetic clamps. 2,412 deadly warships, sitting right at the heart of galactic governance. They wouldn't, Orthmos said, though the absolute conviction that had defined his 2-hour victory speech 4 months ago was entirely gone. They wouldn't dare launch a strike from the center of the conclave. Tell me why not, Secretary General, Savath 9 challenged softly. Give me the real reason. Not the diplomatic protocol, not the legal precedent. The actual, strategic reason why they wouldn't. Orthmos did not answer. He couldn't. At precisely 6 o'clock the following morning, the Conclave sent a formal, highly classified inquiry to the Terran diplomatic mission. They used carefully sanitized procedural language, framing the document as a routine administrative audit regarding civilian vessel registration classifications and secondary hull modifications. Delegate Vasquez responded in 4 hours. Her reply was precisely 2 sentences long. The Terran Union is pleased to cooperate with any routine audit of our civilian shipping registries. We suggest this technical conversation include Fleet Admiral Yarachen, who is currently residing on the Conclave station and remains available for consultation. Savath 9 read the transmission in his office and felt a cold sensation lock around his chest. The translation in his native tongue was precise. It was the feeling of realizing that a trap had not just been set, but had already snapped shut around your ankles while you were still admiring the bait. "She is on the station?" Savath 9 demanded into his comms unit, calling Preth immediately. "Admiral Chen is here." "She has been here for 6 weeks, sir," Preth reported, his voice trembling slightly. "She is listed in the public station registry as a civilian technical advisor for the human fleet transition team." "What has she been doing for 6 weeks?" "She has been conducting daily technical advisory sessions with our conclave maintenance crews," Preth said. "Doing what, exactly?" "Teaching them," Preth hesitated. "Helping our engineers understand human subsystem architecture. Emergency power routing. Reactor cooling overrides. Engine restart sequences." Savath 9 gripped the edge of his desk. "She has been teaching our maintenance crews how to operate Terran warships." "Well, yes, sir," Preth said defensively. "Our engineers requested it. Human reactor control systems are notoriously complex, Preth," Savath 9 interrupted, his tone chillingly sharp. "Run the access logs for the surrendered vessels over the last 45 days. Cross-reference every technician who has stepped foot on those ships with the Terran civilian contractor manifests." A long, agonized silence stretched over the comm line. "Savath," Preth whispered finally. "There are 900 individuals who appear on both lists. 900 Terran naval veterans. Currently working on board those ships as civilian maintenance contractors." Savath 9 closed his eyes. Humanity hadn't lost the negotiation. They hadn't even been playing the game the Conclave thought they were playing. While 17 species spent 14 months celebrating the peaceful disarming of the galaxy's most dangerous young race, humanity had simply walked into the Conclave's front door, handed over their ships, and brought their own crews along to keep the engines warm. Savath 9 sat in the oppressive silence of his office, feeling the physical weight of his realization pressing against his chest. Humanity hadn't been outmaneuvered. They hadn't caved under the pressure of Resolution 7 Theta, nor had they passively submitted like a beaten conqueror. While the Conclave had spent 14 months congratulating itself on neutering the most volatile species to enter the galactic arena in 2 centuries, humanity had executed an operational maneuver so seamless, so brazen, that it was invisible precisely because it was done in plain sight. They were waiting. Not helplessly, the way a prisoner waits in a cell, but the way a predator waits when it has already set the trap and simply requires the right clock to tick down. "I need one more piece of proof," Savath 9 thought. "One undeniable fact to prove I am not chasing ghosts." He pulled up the low-level maintenance logs from the station's engineering grid, specifically the diagnostic archives filed by Conclave tech teams during Admiral Chen's advisory sessions over the past 6 weeks. He filtered the data, searching for energy spikes, system bypasses, or fuel cycling protocols across the docked human fleet. On the 3rd page of the deep diagnostic log, he found it. Every single one of the 2,412 surrendered Terran warships had undergone what the Conclave technicians logged as a standard emergency power systems audit. According to the written commentary, it was a routine procedure recommended by Admiral Chen to ensure that ship life support didn't fail during long-term orbital storage. Except for one detail. An emergency power systems audit on a Terran-built warship required the engineering team to ignite the primary antimatter reactors, bring the sublight drive core up to 60% thermal output, and maintain that output for exactly 4 minutes. Savath 9 ran the math on his terminal screen twice. 412 reclassified heavy destroyers operating in nearby commercial corridors. 2,412 heavy warships sitting in the Conclave's central holding bays, every single one of them fully fueled, expertly crewed by disguised naval veterans, and holding their reactor cores at a pre-warmed, near-instant ignition threshold. They weren't in storage. They were idling at a red light. Savath 9 stood up so fast his chair clattered against the metal deck. He walked to the door, stopped, turned around, and opened a direct, encrypted priority channel straight to Secretary General Orthmos. "We need to meet with them," Savath 9 said the second the visual feed connected. "Now. Not a legal inquiry. Not a formal diplomatic request. An emergency meeting with Admiral Chen, and we need to ask the right question." Orthmos looked haggard on the screen, his pale fur matte and unkempt. "What is the right question, Savath?" Savath 9 stared into the camera sensor. "We need to ask them what they are waiting for." The confrontation took place in the Conclave's primary conference chamber, a massive circular hall lined with the ancient blue seals of the 17 founding species. Orthmos had deliberately chosen this room instead of a private briefing office. He wanted the vastness of 4,000 years of galactic authority to press down upon the human commander. Watching Fleet Admiral Yara Chen walk in and take her seat across the long obsidian table, Savath 9 realized the grandeur was completely wasted on her. Chen sat down with an easy, fluid grace. She wore no formal dress uniform, only the dark, unadorned jumpsuit of a senior technical advisor. "Fleet Admiral Chen," Orthmos began, his voice echoing in the vast chamber. "Civilian technical advisor now, Secretary General," Chen interrupted politely, adjusting her sleeve. "Let us keep our classifications accurate under the law." Orthmos took a slow breath, trying to regain control of the room. "We would like to discuss the current operational readiness of the transferred Terran fleet." "Of course," Chen replied, placing her hands flat on the table. "Which aspect of our compliance concerns you?" Before Orthmos could launch into a carefully prepared diplomatic speech, Savath 9 leaned forward over the table, bypassing protocol entirely. "Why are the engines warm, Admiral?" Savath 9 asked directly. For the first time in 6 years of studied observation, Admiral Chen's eyes shifted away from the Secretary General and locked directly onto Savath 9. There was no annoyance in her gaze, no defensive flicker. Instead, she looked at him with a quiet, sharp respect, acknowledging that someone across the table had finally stopped reading the script and looked at the stage. "Because," Chen said, her voice steady and unervingly candid. "Ships that sit cold for 20 years do not fly the same as ships that are maintained." "Maintained for what purpose?" Orthmos demanded, slamming his palm onto the table. "You surrendered those ships to Conclave custody. They have no purpose under your command." Admiral Chen did not flinch. A small, tired smile touched her lips, not the confident smirk from the disarmament chamber, but something far more grim. 17 months ago, Chen said quietly, the Dravari Collective began quietly moving heavy battle fleets toward the outer Keth border. Not all at once. They moved in small, staggered battle groups, a deployment pattern that your intelligence agencies would have recognized as aggressive prepositioning if anyone in this station had been looking at the right sector. She paused, letting the silence stretch across the massive chamber. "We have been tracking their fleet movements for 11 months, she continued. "We believe the Conclave's sudden enthusiasm for Resolution 7 Theta was not born out of fear of humanity. It was engineered by subtle Dravari diplomatic pressure, specifically to disarm the only military force in this sector capable of stopping their upcoming invasion." Dead silence descended upon the Grand Conference Chamber. Secretary General Orthmos stared at Fleet Admiral Chen, his pale fur flaring along his arms in an involuntary panic response. "You are alleging that Resolution 7 Theta was a Dravari proxy play?" he asked, his voice carefully controlled yet undeniably fragile. "That the High Council was manipulated into disarming your species?" "Not manipulated by deception, Secretary General. Manipulated through your own fear," Chen replied coldly. "The Dravari didn't have to convince you that we were a threat, they simply let your own paranoia do the heavy lifting. They knew that if you saw a force capable of standing against them, your instinct would be to neuter it in the name of galactic balance." She pulled a black glass data chip from her pocket and slid it across the long obsidian table. It came to a stop right in front of Savath 9. We didn't comply with Resolution 7 Theta because we were outmaneuvered, Chen said, looking around the towering room at the ancient seals of 17 empires. We complied because we needed you to believe we were completely neutralized while we verified our intelligence. We needed to be certain. Savath 9 picked up the data chip and inserted it into his interface terminal. A dense cluster of tactical telemetry, long-range radar tracks, and encrypted Dravari troop movements flooded his screen. How long have you had this confirmed data? Savath 9 asked, his eyes scanning the terrifying numbers. For days, Chen said. For days. Orthmos interjected, his voice rising. You sat on active invasion intelligence for 4 days without notifying the High Council. We needed to be sure. Chen met the Secretary General's angry glare without flinching. And more importantly, we needed you to ask us the right question today, instead of simply issuing a blind order for us to stand down. Because if you had ordered us to stand down under diplomatic protocol, we would have been forced to refuse you. And that would have turned this into a very different, very bloody conversation. Savath 9 felt a chill run down his spine. You waited for us to figure out the trap, he whispered. You did, Chen acknowledged with a slight, respectful nod toward Savath 9. Eventually. Orthmos reached for the data chip with a hand that was visibly shaking. As his eyes tracked the red invasion vectors of the Dravari battle fleet, his composure shattered completely. They've crossed the outer Keth boundary, he breathed. A fleet of this scale, the Conclave border garrisons will be swept aside in less than 12 hours. The resolution, we must immediately convene an emergency session of the High Council to suspend Resolution 7 Theta. You don't need to suspend anything, Chen said calmly. Humanity is still in complete compliance with Conclave law. Orthmos blinked, bewildered. What? Those 412 vessels operating in the Kepler corridor are registered civilian freighters, Chen explained, the small, tired smile returning to her face. Their crews are contracted technical personnel. And the 2,000 warships sitting in your lower docking bays are technically Conclave property under maintenance. She stood up, leaning her hands lightly against the edge of the table. If the Secretary General were to issue an emergency logistics authorization, requesting that private Terran shipping companies assist in a high-priority border crisis, I imagine it is entirely within your legal authority to grant it. The full magnitude of the trap finally landed on everyone in the room. It wasn't just a physical counterstrike, it was a masterclass in legal and strategic architecture. You built this, Savath 9 said, his voice filled not with accusation, but with pure, unadulterated awe. From the very moment the disarmament resolution was drafted. You constructed the legal compliance framework so that it could be reversed in minutes without violating a single galactic clause. We built the compliance structure, Chen corrected gently. So that when this moment arrived, the Conclave would have options it didn't know it possessed. For our benefit? Orthmos asked, a complex mix of shame and relief in his voice. For everyone's benefit, Chen said. Humanity has colonies near the Keth border too. We aren't interested in watching the galaxy burn just to prove a point. She checked her wrist calm, then looked up at Orthmos. I will need your emergency logistics authorization within the next 30 minutes for our prepositioning to matter. The fuel reserves won't stay warm forever. Chen turned and began walking toward the heavy blast doors of the chamber. She paused at the threshold, her hand resting on the frame, though she did not look back. For what it's worth, Secretary General, she said quietly into the massive room, we never wanted a fight with the Conclave. We just wanted you to see us clearly enough to stop being afraid of us. She paused for a beat. We're still waiting for that part. The blast doors slid shut with a heavy hydraulic thud. Leaving 17 species sitting in a room built to represent 4,000 years of supreme galactic governance, staring at a data chip left by a woman who had turned an empire's surrender into the ultimate trap. The 30 minutes passed in a blur of hyper-compressed bureaucracy. Orthmos signed the emergency logistics authorization with a hand that barely held the digital stylus steady. Within seconds, the order bypassed the usual weeks of committee debates, flashing straight to the Conclave Station's central control grid. High above the planet, deep inside the station's massive holding bays, the quiet routine of 4,000 years vanished in an instant. Savath 9 stood in the high observation gallery, watching through the massive reinforced viewport. Below him, 2,412 Terran warships, ships that the Conclave had spent over a year cataloging, locking down, and celebrating as monuments to human defeat, woke up. It wasn't a slow, staggered boot sequence. It was a simultaneous, terrifying roar of industrial power. The diagnostics that Admiral Chen's teams had run for weeks hadn't just been maintenance, they were a pre-ignition sequence. Antimatter drive cores flared to life in unison, their blue-white ignition halos lighting up the cavernous dark of the docking bays. Magnetic clamps disengaged with a deafening metallic screech. "Look at the registry feeds," Plinth whispered beside him, his voice trembling as he monitored his handheld pad. "The 412 civilian freighters in the Kepler corridor. They've dropped their cargo pods, Savath." Savath 9 didn't need to look at the screen to know what was happening. In deep space, the reclassified heavy destroyers were already rendezvousing with hidden logistical tenders launched from the Kuiper Belt asteroid armories. Mechanical gantry arms, pre-staged in the dark corners of the Sol system 18 months ago, were mounting heavy kinetic rail cannons and long-range torpedo racks back onto the clean hull mountings. It was a modular rearmament process so precise it looked like an automated assembly line. Within 40 minutes of the Secretary-General's signature, 412 war-ready destroyers had reformed into tight combat wedges, jumping into warp toward the Keth border. Simultaneously, from the Conclave's central docks, 2,000 fully fueled Terran warships surged outward into the void, forming a vast, overlapping perimeter around the station before locking onto the exact same warp coordinates. "They didn't just hide a fleet," Savath 9 murmured, watching the blue warp trail streak across the dark space outside the window. "They pre-positioned an entire war effort inside our own administrative house. 300 light-years away, at the edge of the Keth border sector." The Dravari Vanguard fleet drifted in heavy attack formation. Comprising over 1,500 armored dreadnoughts and planetary assault carriers, the Dravari invasion force had advanced under the absolute conviction that the sector was a wide-open target. Their diplomatic intelligence had assured them that Resolution 7 Theta had neutered the Terran Union, leaving the region's defense completely reliant on a handful of underfunded Conclave border patrols. The Dravari High Commander sat on the bridge of his flagship, preparing to broadcast the final order to cross the border and seize the strategic mineral worlds of the Keth system. Then, space tore open. It didn't happen in standard, orderly warp waves. The sensors on the Dravari flagship screamed in warning as 2,800 warship signatures dropped out of subspace simultaneously. They didn't arrive in defensive hold patterns, they materialized directly across the Dravari's primary vector of attack, forming an impenetrable wall of tungsten armor, active targeting sensors, and primed plasma batteries. On the Dravari bridge, the tactical holos display turned blood red. "Iden signatures," the Dravari tactical officer yelled, his voice cracking with panic. "Commander, the fleet blocking our transit vector, it's Terran military." "That is impossible," the commander roared, slamming his fist onto his console. "The Conclave stripped their fleet 14 months ago. The human navy doesn't exist." "Look at the sensor logs," the officer screamed back. 2,000 heavy combatants in frontline formation. Another 400 heavy destroyers locking railgun arrays onto our flagship right now. Their reactors are running at maximum combat output. For 3 agonizing minutes, 2 massive fleets hovered in the absolute stillness of deep space, separated by less than 50,000 kilometers of void. The Dravari were rational actors. Their entire invasion strategy had been calculated on a simple mathematical premise: striking a helpless, disarmed sector to force a quick concession from a hesitant conclave. They had calculated the cost of fighting the conclave's weak garrisons. They had not calculated the cost of slamming headfirst into the full, undivided strength of the Terran combined arms fleet, rearmed, fully fueled, and operating under a legal mandate handed to them by the conclave itself. The Dravari tactical computers ran the engagement simulations. The outcome was clear: total, catastrophic annihilation of the vanguard within 40 minutes of engagement. Slowly, methodically, the Dravari flagship powered down its offensive weapons arrays. Tactical thrusters fired, and the 1,500 Dravari warships began a slow, deliberate retreat back into their own territory. Not a single plasma bolt was fired. Not a single missile left its tube. The greatest invasion of the century had been broken in less than 5 minutes, not through bloodshed, but through the sheer, terrifying weight of a fleet that wasn't supposed to exist. Back on the conclave station, the silence in the observation gallery felt entirely different now. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating silence of an unseen trap, but the stunned quiet of an empire coming to terms with its own blinding ignorance. Savath 9's comms console chimed with a priority signal. It was Preth. "Savath, the Dravari fleet is holding position," Preth reported, his voice filled with an almost surreal sense of disbelief. "They've received the transit signatures of the Terran vessels. They're withdrawing, sir. Pulling back beyond the border markers. Slow and orderly, but they are retreating." Savath 9 looked out at the empty docking bays where the human fleet had sat for over a year. "No shots fired." "No shots fired," Preth confirmed. "Because of course not," Savath 9 said quietly to himself. The Dravari were rational actors. They had moved against a region they believed was undefended, a region they had been led to believe was permanently stripped of its teeth. Confronted with a wall of 2,800 war-ready human combatants that shouldn't legally or physically have been there, the Dravari ran the numbers. Accepted the mathematical reality of total destruction, and recalculated. Savath 9 pulled up a file on his terminal, a document he had opened and reread a dozen times over the past week while trying to solve the riddle of human compliance. It was the original Co-Institute Threat Assessment on Humanity, written 40 years ago when Earth first made contact with the galactic community. The primary analyst who wrote it had long since retired, but his final recommendation on the last page had been preserved in the archives. Humanity's primary threat characteristic is not their technological advancement, nor their raw military capacity. It is their demonstrated willingness to accept enormous individual and collective cost in service of long-term strategic objectives that are not immediately legible to outside observers. Recommend treating any human compliance or concession as potentially instrumental until the underlying objective is identified. 40 years ago, the Conclave's High Council had skimmed that finding, stamped it under secondary strategic notes, and filed it away in favor of easier, more comforting assumptions. They had assumed that compliance meant surrender, because surrender was what compliance meant to every other species they had governed for 4 millennia. Savath 9 read the paragraph twice more, then closed the file. The humans had not hidden their fleet merely to protect themselves from the Conclave. They had hidden it to protect the entire galactic structure from a threat the Conclave had failed to see coming, all while meticulously maintaining the delicate diplomatic architecture required to keep the galaxy functioning. They had accepted the public, humiliating spectacle of symbolic defeat. Admiral Chen had walked into that grand chamber, placed her ceremonial sidearm on the plinth, and endured the quiet condescension of 17 species. She had done it because the alternative was an open military confrontation with the Conclave that would have fractured the galaxy right on the eve of a Dravari invasion. They had tolerated the Conclave's fear. They had worked around it, maneuvered through its legal loopholes, and quietly protected the very people who were trying to neuter them. Savath 9's terminal chimed again. A high-ranking Conclave security official appeared on the display. "The Secretary-General wants a full, comprehensive debrief," the official demanded briskly. "Everything you know about how they executed this operation, analyst." "Everything I know," Savath 9 replied steadily, is still not enough. What do you mean? I know the mechanism, Savath 9 said. Watching the last faint warp trails fade outside the viewport. I don't know the decision. What decision? The decision to accept the risk, Savath 9 explained softly. They surrendered their fleet formally and sat exposed for over a year on the off chance that we would ask the right question at the right moment. If the Dravari had struck sooner, or if we had refused to listen to Admiral Chen today, the humans would have been forced to deploy a rogue fleet without Conclave authorization, permanently destroying our alliance structure. They took that catastrophic gamble for us, while we spent 14 months celebrating our victory over them. The official on the screen remained silent for a long moment. Should I inform the Secretary General of that interpretation? Tell him exactly that, Savath 9 said. And tell him to pull the 40-year-old threat assessment out of the secondary archives. He terminated the call and walked out of his office into the station's main promenade. The corridor was quiet. He passed a small group of Terran diplomatic staff walking in the opposite direction. They were civilians, officially, unarmed, dressed in modest blue uniforms. As they passed, one of the human aides caught Savath 9's eye. The human didn't offer a grand salute or a boastful smile. He simply gave a slight, solemn nod, the subtle gesture humans used when recognizing someone who had finally, truly understood. Savath 9 nodded back. As he walked toward the executive level, Savath 9 thought about the deep dark between the asteroids and the outer soul belt. He thought about the silent salvage yards that weren't salvage yards, holding heavy railguns in the cold void, waiting patiently for a call that everyone hoped would never come. Humanity hadn't survived their brutal history by being the strongest or the loudest species in the dark. They had survived because across millions of years of evolution, they had mastered the one art the ancient empires had forgotten. The ones who survive are never the ones who beat their chests early. They are the ones who are still standing, calm and prepared, when everyone else finally realizes the game has changed.